Morning and welcome to this event on Brexit and immigration. Is taking back control helping the UK economy? I'm Gemma Tetlow and I'm Chief Economist here at the Institute for Government, and I'll be chairing today's event. At the end of the Brexit transition period, the government made good on its promise to take back control of the UK's borders. Free movement of people ended and the government introduced a new points-based immigration system for EU nationals. But 11 months on, there are widespread labour shortages across the economy. These problems are not, of course, only the result of the new immigration system. COVID and long-term structural problems are also playing a role. But it seems a good time to take stock of how the government's new immigration system is working and ask whether it meets the needs of the UK economy. To discuss these issues, I'm joined by four panellists. We have Seema Farazi, partner in financial services, immigration and Brexit at EY, Madeleine Sumption, who's director of the Migration Observatory, my colleague Giles Wilkes, who's a senior fellow here at the Institute for Government, and Paul Wilson, who's policy director at the Federation of Small Businesses. Before we get started, a few brief housekeeping notes for you. Please do start sending in your questions using the Q&A function in Teams. If there's a question that's already been asked that's similar to the one you wanted to ask, please do uplike the existing question so we know it's popular. And if you're happy to add your name and location, please do, because it's always good to know who we're talking to. We'll be live tweeting this event from @IFG Events, so please do follow and tweet along using the hashtags IFG Immigration and IFG Brexit. This event is on the record and the video and sound recording will be available on our website within 24 hours if you'd like to watch it back. So kicking off then, Madeleine, let me come to you first. How do you think the new immigration system is working, and what impact is the government's preference for high-skilled labour over low-skilled labour in the new points-based system working for the UK economy?
So obviously it's quite early days, and these are also pretty strange times to be trying to evaluate a new system because of the pandemic. The early data that we have on the numbers of people using the system do suggest that EU migration has been pretty low. We have data so far for the first half of the year, and we're looking really only a few thousand people, EU citizens, coming in on work visas if you take out this group called frontier workers who aren't actually living in the UK. So that, that's consistent with the possibility that there's been, that the system will have dramatically reduced EU migration. But obviously, we also had the pandemic going on. It's possible that employers need a little bit of time to adjust to the new system. So I wouldn't necessarily extrapolate from this and say, this is what EU migration is going to be like forever. In terms of the impacts, I mean, in the fullness of time, there will be, hopefully statistical analyses will become possible to actually really try and measure what the impacts have been. In the meantime, a lot of the information we have is sort of anecdotal or qualitative. You mentioned shortages, obviously, and clearly the end of free movement is likely to have exacerbated the shortages. It's just really difficult to disentangle the different factors, because if you look at different occupations where there have been complaints about shortages, there's usually several things going on. So if you take the HGV drivers, for example, which was obviously the big high profile one over the summer, you had the issues with fewer people being able to take tests and become HGV drivers. You had the kind of long-standing difficulties that the industry has had attracting UK workers in, and obviously you've got to remember UK workers are the majority of the HGV driving workforce. And then of course you had the end of free movement, which sort of exacerbated those other problems. The other thing I would just say is that we don't know at this stage. It's not clear how long some of these problems are going to last. Some of them may just be sort of blips that it's related to the very sudden end of free movement, plus the fact that we've got an unusual labour market and employers haven't yet adjusted. But then in some occupations, it may become more of a longer term pattern. And I think to some extent, it depends on the nature of the occupations and how easy it will be for employers to adjust by doing things like automation, or indeed for the economy to adjust with certain sectors shrinking. Overall, the research on immigration has tended to suggest that the impacts are smaller than people intuitively think, and you would expect that in principle to be the case for the end of free movement as well. But yeah, there's still a lot of evaluation, I think, to be done before there's a proper answer to that question.
Thank you. Giles, that's a good kind of link into a question to you. The government was initially reluctant to use the immigration system to overcome the labour shortages. Do you think it was right to be hesitant, and will the new short-term visas that have now been announced help, or will they actually delay the adjustments of the sort that Madeleine was talking about that are needed in the longer term?
Well, great question. Well, the government's first reaction was it seemed to improvise a new economic model to justify the refusal to lighten things, which was based on the idea that too high a labour supply, effectively, particularly in the low skill area, will cause the UK economy to go to a sort of a less lucrative place. So, in other words, rather than investing in training, we will simply ship people in and out over the borders. And so, although this is a short-term inconvenience for people, it's actually long-term going to shake up the UK economy and give us the right incentives to do the things that we need to do to get back on a rising productivity trend. Now, I'll do my best to defend this, because I must admit that for a long time, the explosion in labour supply that seemed to happen after the financial crisis did indeed seem to be having some kind of an effect on causing low wages, that long slow growth in productivity period. And I mean, if you read really great influential books written through that period, like The Wealth of Humans, written by Ryan Abbott, this idea that we're seeing ways of endlessly increasing human labour, and as a result, nobody's ever sort of sharing the prosperity apart from the very lucky people who get access to really valuable intellectual capital, like the workers at the big tech companies and so forth. So maybe if we restricted immigration, restricted labour supply, we'll start seeing much more growth and much more productivity growth and higher wages and more prosperity all around. So does it look like it worked, and have they messed it up? It's difficult because, I mean, any instinctive liberal would say it's very difficult for the centre to be sufficiently versatile and identify where the shortages are and react quickly enough and understand where they're going to be. Leave it to the market. So just let market forces do this correctly. As far as I can see, the wage rises that we are seeing, which is the supposed silver lining behind all these shortages, they're going to be highly restricted to who the beneficiaries are. Most of us are in fact consumers and investors, and for people wearing those hats, it's unequivocally a bad thing. So right now, I would say the jury's definitely out on the idea that having shortages in any part of the economy is necessarily a good thing.
Seema, you advise firms who are using the immigration system. How are your clients finding it? And how do you think the Home Office is administering this new system?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. There was obviously a very significant change that took place in January last year, and a lot of it is actually fundamentally positive. So before you look at the impact of Brexit, if you look at the changes in the immigration system itself, the removal of resident labour market testing, the lowering of the skills level to level 3 to qualify for sponsored visa, the reduction of salary levels, flexibility for individuals to switch between immigration categories, the introduction of the graduate route, much more flexibility for employers around the cooling off period, something that's been quite challenging for high volume users of the system historically, and expedited processing, for example, for those that are new to the system and are looking to get sponsor licenses as quickly as possible. That's all been fundamentally positive. When you add the end of free movement, what is the additional challenge that puts on business? Well, it's largely cost, because the system itself is working quite effectively and efficiently, and given the pressure that we expected the system to come under, it has fared very well. Applications are being processed in good time overall. The system is quite clear, and what the government has shown is that it's willing to course correct, it is willing to listen, and one of the most positive things that we've seen, I think, in immigration that we haven't always historically seen is stakeholder engagement across the board, listening to businesses, listening to industry about what are the particular pressure points, and actually taking those comments on board and changing. I think there are two key pressure points that we're going to see, and I completely agree with Madeleine that it's far too early to gauge the full impact. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, the pandemic, because the pandemic has muted volumes, and particularly EU-UK volumes, and that's where we're going to start to see those costs build up. So I think the two outstanding things that will remain to be seen is what is the pressure on SMEs, how easily are they able to engage with the system, and that's going to depend on things like communications, knowledge, cost, what's the administrative burden that they're put under. For high volume users of the system, so big business, the key thing is going to be cost, the increased cost. Maybe later in the discussion we'll talk about what are some of the initiatives that are being put in place to manage that as we move into 2022.
Thank you. Paul, that's a perfect link to you. How are your members in the small business community finding the new immigration system? And perhaps also, what do they think about these kind of short-term visa options? Does that work for them?
Good morning. So things are really tough from an employment perspective for small businesses at the moment. And obviously we're in a period of transition now. Change is always tough to a degree. That's not a reason not to do it, but it's about how you manage the change, I suppose. So I guess just taking a step back, you know, staff shortages and appropriately skilled staff shortages are as big a barrier for small businesses now as they've been for the last 6 years since we've been asking them about it on a quarterly basis. 38% of small businesses say that access to appropriately skilled staff is a key barrier to growth. And they're also facing a range of cost pressures right across the board, including employment costs. And, you know, looking to next year, unfortunately, we're going to see a national insurance contribution increase, which is going to make employment more expensive and more difficult. So things are tough at the moment. And I think, obviously, there are a range of solutions to that. Skills and investment in skills is crucial, and it's important that small businesses can engage with key skills policies like apprenticeships, and also the immigration system is a key part of that. I would say most small businesses aren't turning to the immigration system at the moment for a couple of reasons. One is that it is just too expensive and complicated for them at the moment. You know, small businesses don't tend to have HR departments, and the costs of bringing someone in on a skilled worker visa, which we estimate to be about £3 grand, are unaffordable for about half of small businesses, according to our research. And the other thing to say is, of course, that a lot of jobs won't be eligible. You know, when we surveyed our members a couple of years ago on this, 41% of jobs in small businesses were deemed low skilled. Now, that's not a term I like, because these jobs are hard. I couldn't do them, but that does mean that they don't necessarily qualify for the current skilled work route, either because they're not on the list, or indeed because the salary level is not high enough, even if they are on the list. So there are issues there.
Madeleine, I think you've done work looking at other countries' immigration systems as well. Is there anything the UK can learn from the approaches other countries have taken about what impact this new approach might have, or different approaches to managing your immigration system?
Yeah, so there's a huge amount of diversity around the world, and obviously some countries have very liberal immigration systems, like Sweden, for example, where basically pretty much anyone could be sponsored and the costs are very low. You have countries like Australia that are much more restrictive, and where they're particularly in the lower paid jobs don't tend to offer many options at all. It's interesting. It's actually difficult to back out any difference, the macro level, any differences in these countries' economic performance, although, basically because there's just so much other stuff going on. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's a single country that's a shining example of doing things well. One thing I do think that the UK can learn from other countries that's really clear is just, and I don't want to be one of these dreadful researchers who comes in and say it's all about having more data, but you look at some other countries and the data is just so much better. I mean, the UK has pretty good data in terms of who's coming in. But we don't have the kinds of data that would really be necessary to evaluate immigration routes. So saying, okay, this guy came in this particular route, how did he do 5 years later? How did he do 10 years later? That kind of data. And if you look at places like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, a lot of them are actually able to evaluate their programs really well. And there is a risk, I think, things are improving in terms of data in the UK, but there's a risk that 5 years from now, we'll look back and actually we won't be quite sure what the impact was, because we won't have had the data to really evaluate it.
Can I just add? Yeah, I was just going to add something to that. So, I mean, when you look at, because we often heat map and look at these systems comparatively, and there are a couple of things that you're benchmarking when you're doing that. So you're looking at accessibility, transparency, what are the lead times to get somebody into place, how easy is the process, what is the cost, is there a resident labour market test involved, etc. And the UK actually does, when you heat map it like for like, the UK does very well on all of that except cost. Cost is the absolutely critical component here. And, Paul alluded to the very high cost in the skilled worker system. They are far above what we see in other jurisdictions, and that to me remains the key pressure point. One of the other things, Madeleine, you mentioned data as well. This kind of feeds into a lot of the narrative around immigration, and actually being an attractive place for international talent is really critical. And the contribution that's made through, we don't have that data where you can easily see that narrative from kind of start to end, what that contribution has been and what the success story looks like. But what you do have is data around the contribution of migrants to the National Health Service through the Immigration Health Surcharge, contribution to the domestic skills agenda through the Immigration Skills Charge, the tax contribution, that's all very well documented. And one of the things that I think the UK probably does need to do better is being more positive about its immigration narrative. And we're starting to see that shift, but we do need, I think there needs to be a lot of focus on that, because ultimately, if you're trying to attract key talent into the UK has to be seen to be attractive to that talent. It's not just about having the right immigration categories, but people have to want to come into the UK and contribute in that way.
And Seema and Paul, when you're interacting with government on issues about your clients, members wanting to employ people from abroad, do you get a positive response from within government at the moment? Is there that positive attitude to bringing in people from overseas, particularly where they have something to contribute, or is there a bit of a negative attitude to having immigrants at all?
I mean, from my perspective, I haven't come across a negative attitude to having immigrants at all, you know, and I do think the Home Office has done a lot of good engagement, a lot of good listening over the last year or two in particular. So that, you know, that said, I think the way we think about what counts as skilled is maybe a little bit old-fashioned. Still, I think there is a preference for, you know, your classic higher education and less weighting put on really important technical skills. And I think that's one of the issues that we see. You know, the fact that your job happens to require something at level 3 equivalent, not level 2 equivalent, but you know, if in all honesty we have a shortage of people with a really relevant skill at a lower level, we need that job to be done. We need that job to be done here. Then I think we need to think more flexibly about what counts as skilled. And that's a broader issue that I think, you know, the government has made commendable efforts to address within the technical education system. And I think that's why the government has quite rightly made some tweaks and introduced some short-term visas more recently to ensure that the immigration system is suitably flexible. But for me, it comes back to that you know, distinction between what we think of as skilled and whether we're thinking of it in quite the right way.
I agree with that, and I think that, you know, there's a lot that you hear anecdotally, but if you look at the evidence, there is this continued stakeholder engagement, and that stakeholder engagement is actually involves a lot of listening and change and course correction. If you look at the innovation that was that we saw during the pandemic from the Home Office in particular to meet very, very practical difficulties that businesses were having because they couldn't get people in offices to do right to work checks, because they couldn't process visas and they needed people to start once their certificate of sponsorship was issued. The UK really led internationally in that space on pandemic, I would say, and we've seen that a lot of that innovation has actually pivoted into the new system. So they haven't kind of parked that, but they've actually taken a lot of that on board, virtual right to work checking being a kind of key example. So I think there's a lot of positive, there's a lot of evidence that you can point to. And I think fundamentally, what the government could have done is say that we're dealing with a massive, a huge change in our immigration system. We're not going to be considering other things until we've got this kind of up and running and we're 6 to 12 months in. They haven't done that. They have continued to engage. We're seeing the unsponsored route being kicked off in the spring of next year, the scale-up route, all of the work that's been done around policy and the sponsorship roadmap, so to make it easier for small businesses to kind of get on that sponsorship ladder and bring talent into the UK. So I think the direction of travel is positive. There are always improvements that can be made, but I think the critical thing is that continued stakeholder engagement and actually listening and changing path where it's necessary.
Madeleine.
Oh, I just wonder if I could come in on that issue of skill, because I think this is really interesting. There's a lot of debate about this. I think in some ways it's unfortunate the issue is really just about the word skill, because when people get divided into skilled and unskilled, then of course you can look at the so-called skilled jobs and see that actually a lot of them are very difficult, and there are all sorts of skills that they do involve. The government approach to this, which is mostly driven by a classification the Office of National Statistics runs, is actually reasonably coherent in that it is looking at the duration of training that is required to do a certain job. So the basic principle is, if a job doesn't require much training, then it should be easier for people who don't have any background in that job to move into it. Whereas if you require, 8 years of training, whether it's sort of technical training or academic training, you're not going to be able to just slot someone new into that job very easily. So I think in some ways the issue is not so much the sort of whether we need a better definition of skill, but I think probably it's about the conversation is really about where, maybe use a different word from skill so people don't get worried about that. And then the conversation is really, okay, well, in what cases is there a case for saying, even though these people don't meet the skill classification, is there still a social value of some kind in having people do these jobs, whether it's, social care, construction, there'll be a different case that people will want to make in every industry. But that, I think, is probably the issue, rather than necessarily I think it would be challenging to sort of redefine ourselves out of this the skill debate, by just using a better definition. I think it's more a fundamental question about, trying to agree as a country, who should be eligible for the immigration system and who shouldn't.
And how is the skills definition interacting with the salary thresholds that are also in the system?
Yeah, it's just one on top of the other, really. And generally, obviously, there's a correlation between the skill classification and the salary. So if you're a pilot, you're not going to have any trouble meeting the 25,600 threshold. There's also an occupation-specific one. But generally, so the jobs that are classified as high skills tend to get higher earnings. You get some jobs where the salary threshold is really important. Because it's this flat rate at 25,600, unless you're on the shortage list. If you're something like a lab technician, where wages are really low, basically the occupation would need to be on the shortage list and have a lower salary threshold, even though it's classified as a skilled job. Basically, the wages are much lower than your average skilled job. So you get these odd cases. Lab technicians is one. Now, HGV drivers actually is another, because it's not classified as a high skilled job because it doesn't take that long to become an HGV driver. But they actually, when you look at the wages, they're earning a huge amount more than most people in jobs that require that level of training for various reasons, including the hours they work and the fact that it's quite a difficult job. So yes, they sort of interact in interesting ways.
And Giles, Madeleine's already talked about how difficult it is to really untangle what's going on with the new immigration system, given everything else that's going on with the pandemic. But do you think there's any evidence so far that this is affecting how the UK labour market is working or how employers are operating?
Well, I'll use the same excuse as others in that it's an incredibly difficult time with the furlough system just ending, and a lot of other movements have taken place at the same time as the immigration change, in particular a large movement of older people out of the workforce, as well as our own particular Brexit related issues. So I would say that there have been surveys, and I think there's been some really good work from the Resolution Foundation and the Centre for Economic Performance, finding that there is more enthusiasm for investment and training in some places to make up for it. I've noticed anecdotally that you also see far more young people in those sort of retail jobs. I mean, I was in a cafe over the weekend and there was just a constant sort of a row of 15-year-olds seemingly being trained into how to be a barista and use the till. What I struggle with at a higher level is, what is the underlying theory behind the idea that if you're below a certain level, and I totally agree with the caveats about whether that makes sense to define skill purely by salary, below a certain level, we shouldn't be having people from overseas, is the implication that either we don't need those activities or we should be doing them all ourselves. And I thought the idea behind the economic model was we want to move towards higher skilled work. So is the idea, if work is really lowly paid, that should be for the Brits? Because that doesn't seem to make much sense to go along with the overall idea. You'd have thought the overall idea is we want to have the space and investment to get better at high skilled things ourselves and use the trading system in a sense to fill in all of the gaps. But So I don't know whether any of the other panelists have a neat solution to that paradox.
I'm going to suggest one. So the youth mobility scheme is a really critical, serves a really critical purpose in the immigration system. And back in, I think it was the end of 2018, when one of the first white papers came out on the future immigration system post-Brexit, it was suggested that there would be a UK-EU reciprocal youth mobility scheme. And there was a sense that that would be able to support some of these gaps through transient labour whilst the domestic skills were being built up. And that hasn't happened in the way that was expected for a multitude of reasons, although I know there is continued work to get to that end. And we know that the UK has negotiated youth mobility schemes with other countries in the meantime, and it's enhanced its youth mobility scheme with Australia. But that's a really good way to get kind of temporary labour into the UK economy whilst the UK is bolstering the domestic skills pipeline as well. And that's something that we know that businesses are very warm to, that idea, firstly because it's reciprocal, so UK nationals are similarly benefiting from being able to go overseas and bring those skills back to the UK. So that's something which is, I would say, has kind of fallen off the radar as a priority for business, but actually it would serve multiple purposes here when we're talking about shortages. I think the other thing just to point out is that we were, we've all been kind of living the experience if we drive cars that require fuel about the challenges of the market. But none of this is really surprising, because if you look at research, if you look at research that came out in early 2019, there was research in the Institute of Public Policy and Research where they looked at what are the sectors that were going to be most impacted by this change. And you could see transport and storage right at the top, followed by manufacturing, retail, leisure, etc., and all the way down to financial services and professional services. So again, kind of getting ahead of these challenges, we have an opportunity to now go back to those lists. And what are the next areas that we could be hitting problems with? What's the investment that's needed in the domestic skills agenda? And how can we, at the same time, support the necessary immigration into the UK to make sure that we're not facing similar problems in different sectors?
Paul, I was wondering, would your small business members find something like an expanded youth mobility scheme valuable? How would that help?
100%, yeah. No, we looked at particularly the tourism and hospitality sectors in the summer. We did a report, a menu for recovery, and of course, those are sectors where the new skilled worker route just doesn't work. Youth mobility schemes could be a really useful and quite pragmatic way of actually ensuring that there is enough workers in those sectors who, let's not forget, have been hit incredibly hard by the pandemic for a host of reasons. A, the fact that they literally couldn't open for quite a while, but B, also, the conditions that workers were often having to be in at perhaps greater risk of exposure to COVID than in some other sectors, and people have reappraised. So at the same time as that EU labour has been cut off to a degree, a lot of people who work in hospitality are thinking, well, I've been on furlough, I've been doing a second job, maybe I quite like that second job, maybe I need to do something else. And what it's meant is for the hospitality sector, for example, that they've had to be really creative with how they've gone about opening up. And maybe looked at opening up for shorter hours or fewer days than they would ideally like to do, maybe paying people more. And of course, as Giles alluded to up front, all of that then feeds through into customer choice and cost.
Madeleine.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to this issue that Giles raised about the what we want the composition of the economy to be like in some ways. So if you reduce the supply of EU workers, there are obviously various different adjustments. So the adjustment that people always talk about is, getting Brits into the jobs and paying them more. But of course, there are different adjustments that we can also expect. But the most obvious one is just that there will be fewer of these types of jobs, either because of automation, where that's possible, or just the sectors becoming smaller. We had a big expansion, for example, in labour-intensive horticultural production since 2004. Some of that one would expect might go into reverse. In the short run, that can be disruptive. In the long run, I think the debate that's going on now, but among economists in this field, I think, is basically, is that a good thing or not? Now, Giles's argument effectively is, well, we're going to, Giles, you tell me if I'm wrong characterizing your argument, but effectively, if the Brits are better off, if workers come in and they do these jobs and Brits are then kind of working more in maybe supervisory roles or the more productive work, then that's a good outcome for everyone. I think the sort of counter argument is that if migrants are doing low wage work, they obviously, it's not just trade in the sense that they become part of society too. So if you're looking at, if you think, what is the definition of a high wage, high productivity economy, not to misuse a phrase that's been bandied around a lot. I think that there's a conceptual question which I don't have an answer to, which is, are migrants part of that or not? Because you can have a vision which, if you took it to the extreme, leads you to sort of the UAE, where basically you have very large number of low productivity jobs being done by migrant workers, and maybe the more productive jobs being done by the locals. Or you could say, actually, no, migrants are part of that, and therefore, even if it makes the migrants better off to come here and do those jobs, it still is reducing the average across the economy. The youth mobility scheme is a sort of interesting way of hedging these positions, right? Because you say, okay, well, we'll have people come, but we're not going to make them part of society because they'll have to leave after 2 years, and that has pros and cons as well, which some people like and some people don't. But I think there isn't an obvious sort of philosophical answer to that question. What's the right outcome there?
And I mean, you pointed there to the UAE as an example of a society where they use a lot of migrant labour for low skilled and sort of section that off. Is there a country you would point to as kind of the opposite model, that they've kind of gone for automation and high skilled jobs for everyone and avoiding low pay?
I mean, I guess the examples that are always used, so Japan often comes up for better or worse. Australia is interesting because I think there are no countries where they literally just don't have, well, no sort of comparable countries where they just have exceptionally low levels of migration to low wage jobs, partly because you always end up with people coming in through family routes or as refugees, and many of those people will join the low wage workforce. But I would say Australia is probably the most comparable country I can think of to the UK, where they have a work visa system that's pretty restrictive on the low end.
Giles, did you want to come back on that?
I think Madeleine has very fairly characterised my view there. I mean, I struggle as an instinctive liberal to see a big negative externality to having other people in the workforce and society as well, which is maybe my sort of slight metropolitan bubble. But I also think, I mean, as we've seen, for example, I believe with turkey farming, as a result of inadequate labour supply, we're buying our turkeys being reared overseas. So all we've done is like shift some activity. Maybe even the very same workers are still managing the turkey production thing, but they've just moved away, and we're using our capital and land and skills at a different level less, and we've just shifted it slightly, and then we buy them in instead. So I don't see what's been gained there, unless, and it's a perfectly valid view to have, you see a really big negative externality from having all of these people knocking around on our shores, as opposed to a few dozen or 100 miles away, which just feels to me like quite an old-fashioned view. I'm certainly not implying that that's yours, Madeleine, but it's just you would have to stack it against the clear economic cost of losing some of that activity. You'd have to have a pretty significant sense that you're also got a big negative externality from having that.
Did you want to come back in, Madeleine?
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think in some way people's views, I'm very non-political and stuff, but I think people's views do sometimes just come down to effectively whether they like migration or not. And so if you look at this kind of basic observation that the impacts of migration tend to be a lot smaller than people expect, some people look at that and say, great, well, there's no problem. We can have migration, and there are some benefits here and there, and it doesn't have a lot of negatives. Other people look at that and say, fine, well, the costs of restricting migration actually are pretty low, so we can have lower migration, and it's not going to ruin our economy. And I think that actually ends up being a sort of non-economic view that people come down one way or the other, depending on their sort of more subjective social views about whether immigration is a good thing or not.
Can I just add, just to add one point there, because Madeleine raised, you mentioned refugees as well. So obviously we have a number of you know, there is a wide pool of individuals in the UK who do not have effective routes into employment. Now, some of that is, you know, domestic individuals who don't have the right skill set, or they don't have the right training. But we also have a large population of refugees in the UK. We've got individuals who are coming into the UK under the Afghanistan programs at the moment, and there isn't really a very clear pathway into economic integration for these individuals, and many of these people are very qualified in some of the fields where we need support, whether that's HGV drivers, whether it's law, whether it's medicine, whether it's social care. And one of the things that I think we could do better in the immigration system is really supporting that the integration into employment into the UK and into the socioeconomic structure of the UK. I think that's an area where there's a bit of a gap, and there is a talent pool that is here now, and we should be doing better to make the most of that and to give opportunities to individuals who can actually contribute right now and are in the UK at the moment.
Thank you, Seema. And I think that's actually quite a nice link to the first question I was going to take from the audience. Jill has asked, given that immigration is now a key economic variable, is it still right for the Home Office to be in charge of immigration for work? Madeleine, can I put that one to you first?
I think, I mean, it's a difficult question. Actually, IFG has written some of the best things on this topic, I think, about, you know, whether how much it actually, well, firstly, whether sort of moving things around is worth it given the disruption that it causes. I think at the end of the day, I mean, there are obviously cultural differences between departments, and I think while in principle you shouldn't get a different outcome in a sort of very theoretical model, you shouldn't necessarily get totally different policy if you put it in another department. I'm sure that you would in practice, and that it would be more liberal if it wasn't in the Home Office. So I think then, you know, the debate becomes just about what, you know, people then will want it in the department that will give them the answer that they want. And so that it's sort of, you know, the fight about what policy should be, and, you know, gets elevated to a fight about institutions, as the political science literature has told us, has predicted will happen.
Paul?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I actually used to be a civil servant myself, so I've seen a fair number of machinery of government changes that I was party to. I think, you know, what we need to move towards is a system whereby departments have shared success measures. So for me, it really shouldn't matter that Home Office is the lead department, provided that they're collaborating really, really closely with BEIS and with the Treasury on what the economy needs within this space. And I think, you know, over the last few years, government has done a lot to try and create clarity over what departments are trying to achieve and try and create those, you know, shared success measures. And funnily enough, if you were to move it from one department to another, what generally ends up happening is all these people who are working on it in that one department move across to the other department. So in practical terms, it can be a lot of upheaval for not a lot of benefit. So for me, it's about the, you know, those clear success measures, Home Office thinking about what business needs as well as all the other requirements, and then being publicly accountable there.
Charles?
I will surprisingly agree that it does need to stay with the Home Office because there's too many security advantages. But the point Paul made there about needing to work together, if I can just back up with an anecdote, that under the coalition there was a proposal for something called a security bond, where money is put down by an immigrant looking to come here that's taken away if some sort of conditions are broken. And it was so rare for the different sides of the Whitehall immigration debate to meet that the conception of what this thing actually meant was not at all shared until we finally had a catastrophic meeting in the Cabinet Office, whereas it emerged that the Home Office thought, great, this is a new hurdle that will make it even more difficult to come to the country. We're going to say, not only do you have to do all these other things, now you've got to also post a bond. Whereas BIS was saying, this is a great thing. Instead of having all of this nonsense, why don't we just say people have to post a bond? And then and so the totally different conception of the whole thing, and it went up in flames because the two just saw no advantage in talking to one another.
Seema?
Yes, I think I agree with everything that's been said, and I think you have to split out policy from operations. It's very difficult to envisage the operation of the system sitting anywhere other than with the Home Office. And we know that one of the key things that the Home Office are doing at the moment is looking at their border strategy, border and security strategy to 2025, creating virtual borders, etc. And there's a lot of work in place to improve also the immigration processes and make everything online. I think the policy point is a very important one, and I agree with what Paul said, and we have actually seen some of that already. So if you look at the innovation strategy where they're talking about immigration, that's coming out of BAIS. If you look at the strong references to immigration and having positive policies in place coming out of the budget, the spring budget and the autumn budget. And of course, we know that the Office for Talent, which is it's shifting mode at the moment, but that has also been part of number 10, and now the Cabinet Office to focus on driving attractiveness of the UK to talent. So I think from a policy perspective, there needs to be a multi-stakeholder approach. From an operations perspective, I think I can't see that moving away from the Home Office anytime soon.
The next question has come from Lewis Keller of the CBI, who says that since Brexit, the ending of mutual recognition of professional qualifications has added complexities to companies, especially in professional services. Is that something that any of you have come across as an issue, and should the government do more to strike bilateral agreements with EU members around this? Seema, perhaps I can come to you first.
Well, yes, I think it's probably the short answer, and it's one of many problems that kind of are not purely immigration, but sit outside of the immigration system and create additional hurdles. So certainly in some sectors this is more challenging than others, but there is more work that needs to be done. If we look at some of the mobility agreements, for example, with Switzerland, we know that there is specific provision in some of those agreements for the mutual recognition of qualifications. So yes, I would agree that more needs to be done.
Paul, is that something that your members are also encountering?
It's not something that I've talked about a lot at FSB, but it will be a problem. And I mean, it's something I know a little bit about from other roles that I've done. And obviously it is something that was lost when we moved out of the EU. There was quite a good single market, particularly looking at professional services. And I think mutual recognition of professional qualifications was part of the answer there. And obviously we're also talking about, workers from UK flying in and flying out of, say, EU countries. That's an area that became a lot more uncertain as a result of it. So I think it is something, because trading services is always a bit more complicated than trading goods, and perhaps doesn't always get the amount of attention that it needs and deserves. And I think it is something that we'll need to keep looking at under the new arrangements. I think it's a really good point.
Madeleine, I'll come to you next. Perhaps I can tack on another question that's coming on quite similar lines, which is on this point of further bilateral relationships arrangements between the UK and single EU countries. Is there more that the UK government could be doing on those? Over to you, Madeleine.
Yeah, on the recognition of qualifications, just the one thing I thought I would add is that it's actually really difficult to get these agreements. We had it in the EU, partly because the EU took such a brutal approach to sort of ramming it through, and it was very unpopular at points with the different regulators, because the EU effectively said, if you're on this list, you are not allowed to impose any more requirements on this person from Germany or what have you, regardless of whether you think they're qualified to do the job. And actually for the most part it worked very smoothly, but it wasn't always popular. When you then, outside of that framework, when you try and then voluntarily conclude these agreements, maybe with like-minded countries, United States, Australia, what have you, it just is a morass of difficult negotiations, because you've got all of these different bodies. You've got this sort of for every occupation, you've got a different professional body that's governed in different ways that the government doesn't necessarily control. So it's actually, there's a long history of government saying, brilliant, let's have an agreement on recognition of professional qualifications, and then basically it all fizzling out because it was just too hard to do it, and no one could agree. On the other point about bilateral relationships, I mean, the big thing here, I think, at the moment is the youth mobility scheme. That's probably, there are lots of things, bits and pieces of immigration that tend to come into bilateral agreements or free trade agreements. They often tend to be relatively narrow, kind of looking at business travel arrangements, for example, intra-company transfers. Probably the one that substantively might have the most impact on the overall immigration landscape in the UK, therefore, would be youth mobility. The government has said that it wants youth mobility schemes with EU countries, but it's not clear. There's been no update as to whether any of those negotiations are progressing, as far as I'm aware.
The next question has come from Hartley Miller, who asks, apart from political intransigence, are there any reasons for not introducing a Canada-style regional immigration system, for example, for Scotland or Wales separately? No one like to take that one? Madeleine, perhaps I can put it to you.
Yeah, I mean, I probably should. I wrote a paper on this a few years ago, and I think basically there are pros and cons to this system. If you look at it from a purely national level and say, okay, I'm sitting here in Westminster, what system makes sense for the whole UK? The arguments for a regional system are actually not that strong, because the regions per se are not so different from each other if you look at the general economic indicators. So if you wanted to sort of look at some data and say, okay, well, what do these different parts of the UK need? You'd actually struggle to come up with a coherent system that's better than just having one simple system across the board that employers, especially employers who have offices in more than one location, they don't want to mess around with different requirements, you know, when their person travels from Scotland to London or what have you. However, if that's the perspective from Westminster, and probably the perspective from the sort of you know, large employers with multiple locations. If you're in Scotland, you may see it quite differently, because basically the concern there is like, okay, well, we want a different immigration policy from what they want in Westminster, and actually a lot of this is sort of, you know, political choices, not necessarily a kind of technocratic economic decision about whether wages are sort of 2% lower in Scotland than they are in the rest of the UK or what have you. And so actually, I think in some ways it ends up being not so much an economic question about how do you optimize immigration for the whole of the UK, because I actually think regional systems, it's difficult to do that with a regional system. I think it's more a matter of principle about where it is appropriate, at what level it is appropriate for decisions to be taken about this, and whether you think, you know, devolved administrations or cities or regions should have a say over what kind of immigration policies they have.
Does anyone else want to comment on that question? No, okay. The next question is specifically on agriculture. Does anyone feel sufficiently expert on the agricultural sector to take a question, or shall I move on to the next one? Yeah, in that case, apologies to Philip Harknett, but we may have to park your question on how to make agricultural roles more attractive to British labourers. So the next question from an anonymous questioner is, do you think the government will need to impose some sort of training incentive offer for those sectors with shortages? Do we need to do more apart from limiting the supply of workers to incentivise shortage sectors to do the training that's needed? Paul, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think training incentives are important. It's not, you can't just limit the amount of immigration and assume the training will take place. And actually, there's something around incentivizing training in certain sectors. I think, you know, from a Federation of Small Businesses perspective, we were quite pleased to see the commitment to things like skills boot camps that the government announced at the recent spending review and budget. And also, I think there's a point around incentivizing smaller employers to be able to engage with key skills policies. So, you know, apprenticeships, for example, it's been the kind of flagship vocational training route for many years, but it is still very difficult for smaller employers to engage with that, to be attractive to a training provider, to have that sort of critical mass of enough learners to get what they need. And I think some of the incentives that the Chancellor announced, I think intended as sort of COVID specific incentives to take on an apprentice or take on a T-level placement, the FSB think they need to be prolonged into the future, because actually they're really valuable at encouraging smaller employers who want to be able to engage but can't always afford to be able to do so, to be able to take on an apprentice or an additional apprentice or a T-level placement student. And I think if you can carry on with some targeted incentives, it could make a real difference to making sure that all employers of all sizes can really benefit from the skills system.
Giles, did you have a comment on that?
Well, I guess my only concern, I'm putting on the hat of, I imagine, a sceptical Treasury special advisor, is I imagine there's been hundreds of training schemes over the years, and we're still in this position where there's been quite a low incentive to, or there seems to be low take-up of training amongst the corporate world for the last 10, 15 years. And the apprenticeship, as Paul says, the apprenticeship levy was meant to be the solution to that. And now we're also trying the idea of labour shortages too. So sort of both the sort of demand side and the supply side of all sort of working together. I could see them wondering what's different now and what's different with this new thing. Is it simply, you know, one extra bump to the budget, or is there some new idea behind this? Because part of the problem is it's a classic area for public support training, because it's not only the employer who benefits. That employee goes away and becomes useful to the whole economy. So it's a classic spillover. But there's so many other things being tried. I'm just wondering what would make an extra one now different, and what will ensure that it doesn't get cut or messed around with over the years ahead. So that's just a very sort of world-weary Whitehall kind of answer.
The next question has come from Philip Mead, who asks whether government policy should be more supportive of British universities to attract highly talented people from abroad, and whether there should be more encouragement to graduates to apply for work visas upon graduation. Seema.
Yeah, and I think the first big step towards that has already been taken with the introduction of the graduate route last year. And we, I say the introduction, it's almost like a reintroduction, because many years ago we had something called the Tier 1 post-study work visa, which was quite similar to the graduate route. So I think the ability for individuals to kind of remain in the UK economy and look for work at their own time and pace is something that will make the UK much more attractive when universities are looking at attracting students to the UK. The flexibility in the system as well to switch into other categories, I think, is all good news. It's probably early days to start looking at numbers, and of course we know that universities have similarly been hit by the pandemic. So I think looking at how effective that route is going to be is going to take a bit of time. But again, I come back to the narrative. So having these routes is great, but in order to get people into universities, into employment in the UK, you have to have a positive narrative around what the UK is doing to attract talent. And we're starting to see some of that. We saw a new initiative announced in the autumn budget to ensure that outside of the UK that message is being spread. So I think we will start to see some improvements from the graduate route, from the flexibilities, and then from some of the new initiatives to enhance the UK's attractiveness overseas.
Next question from Nicholas Wood. It's on a slight tangent, but he's picked up on a point that was particularly highlighted in a recent FT article about the large number of older people who seem to have withdrawn from the labour market during the pandemic. Giles, I know you've been looking a little bit at this. What are your thoughts on this? And I'll come to the rest of the panel about how might this impact on the UK's need for migrant labour as well. Giles.
It's a really interesting point, because it's also one of the big pushes of that large increase in labour supply under the coalition, where we abolished the default retirement age, and also at the same time, rather more brutally, because incomes in the whole economy fell, the incentive to work was much higher. So the whole supply of labour came out, and it affected right across the board, but I believe older workers too. My cowardly answer would be it's extremely unwise to judge too early, because there's all sorts of rather unique circumstances right now. One of them is that it's literally become more dangerous to work because of COVID, particularly for older people, and that, we should hope, is a temporary fact, and might well be gone by the spring, as we seem to be saying over COVID. But by then, hopefully everyone will be boosted, people will be outdoors more, the treatments will be better. And once that factor's away, you might see them recover. The other really interesting temporary fact that I don't think has been discussed enough is the wealth effect, that people have done really well because of COVID support, because of the huge boom in asset prices going on. A lot of people have just simply benefited and can afford to have another look at a different kind of lifestyle. And that, plus the huge prompt of working from home suddenly for the first time, you just see so many different anecdotes that people say, oh, hold it, well, I should try and think about something different. Again, we really don't know whether that might be temporary or not. And my suspicion is that normal economics will reassert itself. There's going to be some difficult times fiscally for the UK in the years ahead. And that group will gradually return. But it might be quite a while, and it might therefore have some very important short-term effects.
Madeleine, is this something that you on the Migration Advisory Committee have been thinking about as a factor that might affect the outlook for the need for migrant labour?
Yeah, I mean, I should also add here, personal capacity for the Observatory and not speaking on behalf of the committee. But one thing I will say, I mean, I think, yeah, obviously all of the points that Giles made are very important about, you know, how long will this last. I think in terms of thinking about, well, what does this mean for the need for migrant workers? I would generally advise caution in taking an overly deterministic view about how migration should respond to the sort of numbers of people coming in and out of the workforce, because there isn't a fixed need for labour. Obviously, there are impacts. If you have a lot of people retiring in specific occupations, for example, that may increase demand. But I think when you think about the impacts of migration, it's usually more important to look at things like how, you know, what is the sort of wages and productivity of people coming in, what contributions they're making to public finances, what, you know, are there spillover effects that will benefit other parts of the economy, thinking kind of, you know, more of the specific jobs that they're doing, rather than trying to sort of worry too much about whether we have the right overall number of migrants, because I think most of the attempts to work out what the overall number is, that's not very successful, basically.
Next question from Ramsey Ross, and I think this goes back a bit to the discussion we were just having before about the need for different immigration systems in the different parts of the UK. Ramsey asks, does the cost of housing militate against significant regional labour mobility? Paul, Seema, perhaps I can put this one to you. Is that something that businesses that you work with come across as an issue, that you can't move workers from one part of the country to another because of the differences in housing costs and the impact of that on disposable incomes?
Well, I mean, our members wouldn't come to us and say, oh, you know, it's housing costs that's the problem. But this idea that, you know, we've got a high vacancy rate and suddenly we've got lots of people who need jobs and it's as simple as that. Obviously that isn't the case, and it does very much come down to different regions, and people are sort of anchored in a particular region. Maybe their child goes to school there, they've bought a house there. It's not as simple as to say, all right, well, I've got that particular skill set, so I'm going to uproot and move to a different bit of the country. And I think that is why you know, there's going to be quite a long period of adjustment now, as you know, we've had all the people who've maybe hung on to their roles or been furloughed during the pandemic. They've now perhaps decided to make that move, and this adjustment period is going to take quite a while. That's not to say, again, that the answer is necessarily needs to come from the immigration system. It's one of the, I suppose, options for providing some sort of temporary relief as that adjustment takes place.
Seema.
Not much to add to that, really. I agree with Paul. I don't think it's the number one issue that is brought to the table when people are considering this. But of course, businesses who are using the system at high volume, many of them will be providing housing allowances, etc., particularly for individuals who are transferring from overseas. So yeah, I think it's one of those problems in the ecosystem, but maybe not one of the ones that's impacting entrance to that system.
Madeleine, I'll put a very quick, very factual question to you. It's coming from Katie, who asks, is there a breakdown available of what percentage of jobs migrant workers occupy within different skill knowledge levels?
Yes, there is. And in fact, you can go to the Migration Observatory website, and there's a briefing about called Migrants in the Labour Market, in the UK labour market, and it has all of the data on the jobs that migrant workers are doing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I knew you'd be able to help us out with that one. So I think this will probably have to be our final question, so we're coming up towards the end of time. But Samuel asks, will we ever know if markets correct themselves with the constraints on labour supply and through migration? Essentially, his contention is, will governments not just always kind of panic and then ease the immigration controls when things start to go a bit wrong? So will we ever know if the market self-corrects? Giles, I'll come to you first.
I would say that it takes a very long time, and I mean the books that I keep by the side of the desk to try and understand what it was like when we last did it have got titles like this attractive looking number here, Managing the British Economy in the 1960s, where you can find things like unemployment hitting 0.6% in the West Midlands, and all the concern being, how can we find the workers to bring people in? We had a long periods of relative labour shortage in this country, and it took a long time for us to realise that it didn't turn us into that enlightened Scandinavian style, high investment, high training. Now, maybe things are different. I mean, it's a very different kind of world there, manufacturing and so forth being much stronger. But it normally takes a very, very long time and a massive political argument to change that sort of thing. So, and even then it will be disputed. Some people will still think of that as a golden age, whereas at the time they thought they were totally declining all the time. So I think it will be difficult.
Would anyone else like to come in on this one? Madeleine?
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of that question is sort of, will the government resist the calls for more immigration, and therefore we would never find out because immigration policy will become liberal again? I think so far, I mean, I don't have the crystal ball on this, but if you look at the measures so far, for example, on HGV drivers or pork butchers and poultry workers, where additional visas were introduced, these are very narrow measures. They're very short term. They were, introduced with such a short window for applying. We don't know what the take up is going to be. So I would say that so far the government sort of basically is sticking to its original plan, even though there have been this sort of, I would say, probably quite marginal tweaks. In terms of whether we will ever know kind of statistically what the impacts were, assuming that policy goes ahead on its current course, it's actually often, especially in a time of COVID when all of the data is messed up, it's actually often really difficult to get a solid measure of what the impacts of immigration policies were. So my suspicion is that we'll get some statistical analysis and maybe it'll tell us something, but we won't have the clear picture that we would like to see in terms of what the impacts of this have been.
And Paul and Seema, do your members and your clients feel they have a clear enough steer from government of the long-term trajectory of immigration policy that they can adjust their behaviour to?
Well, I mean, as I said at the start, small businesses are not rushing in droves to use the immigration system. The vast majority don't use it because it's too costly, too complex, and it's, they would rather recruit people locally, train them up themselves if they can. So I don't think that these short-term visas that come in have somehow made business eyes light up and think, great, immigration is going to solve everything, we don't need to worry. That is absolutely not the case.
I think I would just add that we said at the outset that one of the key challenges is cost in the system, and so I think all eyes are now going to be on the spring 2022 changes and the new categories that are being introduced, and looking at how far they will go to alleviate some of those cost challenges, and how the sponsor simplifications will make it easier for smaller businesses as well to engage with the system.
Thank you all very much. We are now out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap up there. But I've certainly found this a really interesting discussion about how things are working at the moment, and a bit of a look ahead to what we may and probably will never know about how the new system is operating, what impact it will have on the UK economy. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you very much to my panelists, Paul, Madeleine, Giles and Seema, and please do join us again for the next of our IFG events.